Whoa. All right. Yeah. I know I'm early, so that's okay. Let's see. If I got my. I should not have this blare in my ear. Sorry. Checking my levels. I was doing some testing. My audio, I thought, was not anything to write home about yesterday. So I've been on working on my audio level art. Got my Essence of Wind here. Check my virtual camera settings. You know what? I think I'm going to turn off my virtual camera. Claim. Claim. Uh, so how you been doing, folks? I've been doing okay. Getting things a little bit stabilized over here. The chain gun is getting a boost today. That means we have to shriek in terror whenever we hear that of a chain gun starting up. Because they all got plus 20% damage. Ah! Help. I want to go back to that thing about Valorant on an i5 with GTX 1050 Ti. It's impossible to stream. If somebody could tell me, you know, what to do, but I tried everything. I turned my OBS every possible setting down to low quality. Right, lowered the resolution, lowered the frame rate, lowered the encoding quality for higher speed encoding. Still got encoding overloads and lag when OBS ran at the same time with. So right now I can't do it, which is like making me think, well, January, maybe I'll get a gaming computer. It's about time for my daughter to have an upgrade, and I could put the GTX 1050 Ti at her disposal there. What's going on here? Can I spin the wheel? No, I only have one fortune key. That sucks. Alright, so I guess what would be nice is if I showed this morning on this layout in my latest video, the underwater mech girls. Let's see. And what that will require is a VLC source. UMG, I'm going to call it Underwater Mech Girls. Let's see. Get it added in there. Let's see. Add files. Downloads folder. There she goes. Kabang. Kaboom. Wow, look at that. Isn't that bizarre? Did you know I married a Mongolian? My first wife was from Mongolia. Well, she had a Beijing hookah, but her ethnicity was Mongolian. And you know, Mongolians are very demonized. In American literature and propaganda and stuff. The all of China is a typical thing to characterize them as the Mongol horde, the Mongol hordes or whatever. Not even to make a distinction between the Mongolian people and the Chinese people. So I was really open-minded, I guess. Her mother and father were science people working on radar, so they had they're good patriotic Chinese, and her grandfather, I think it was the paternal grandfather, was actually a hero of the people in China or whatever. He did some engineering, alleviating flooding issues or whatever, which is a very, in Chinese culture, it's a great heroic thing, when floods are causing all the suffering and stuff. If you divert the waters and save the people or whatever, you can be a big hero of the country. So my first wife, she was riding on the coattails of the fact that her grandfather was hero, big Communist Party, muckety muck. But she herself, after we were married, I discovered that she was like very spoiled, and she didn't do any schoolwork, so she kept getting expelled from school. She's like, I'm a big muckety muck, you can't expel me. I was like, yeah, they can. That doesn't work. And this is what happened. China has to deal with a lot of corruption. This is a fundamental problem you get, where you have somebody that's really big in the party that's actually done some great service to the country, right? And then the granddaughter or whatever is like, I don't have to do anything because of him, because I'll just come down on you like a ton of bricks, and she was like that. And this is the thing too. In an authoritarian society, people really put themselves in layers, like what the person reveals to you is maybe not the core of their being. So I would say, but what's very fascinating is, like, I noticed this sort of the Ren and Stimpy dynamic. It's like there have been girls that I look at them in my life or whatever, and I really like that girl. We would be perfect together, but I end up with a girl that's mean to me, and she ends up with a guy that's mean to her. It's like the Ren and Stimpy kind of thing, right? So even though it's like, by the time I was dating a Mongolian girl at college, I was tired of all the American marriage. It's sort of like a business. The girl does this prenuptial. I know it's not like that all the time. And like I said, usually the really nice girls, they get the bad guys, and the really nice guys, they get the bad. That's just the way. It's just a pattern, but like, who wants to? I got to a point where I would look at American girls and I would just like not even feel any kind of attraction anymore. Because there was just so many situations that I had seen where they sign a prenuptial agreement, they get a divorce, they get another marriage, and then they get a divorce, and they go through this long cycle. They bankrupt all these guys, 1, 2, 3, 4, you know. And one of my classmates, what she did is she hooked up with this guy, and he was, really popular or something like that. She was big on popularity, It's still in the high school mentality or something like that. But they bought a house together, and they had it built. They had this house built in these neighborhoods over here. Nice place. And then she decided she wanted to change up, get somebody else, so they came to an agreement that they would just split the house. He would live in one part and she'd live in the other part, and then she'd have her married boyfriend or whatever like that. But one day her original guy, he got drunk. And the other boyfriend was like, la 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 around the house. And the guy's like, yeah, you know what? Blam! And shot the guy and killed him. Put it life in prison. Got life in prison, right? I don't know if it. I just didn't even want to look at it, But you see that kind of stuff going on in our relationships. It's like it's consumerism on steroids. It's like people are just a commodity. So the woman is she's shopping around for the best car, whatever like that. And likewise, I had this situation. I fell in love with. I had this terrible crush on a girl that was like 4 years my senior. So we hooked it. She came back from Florida after going off to a 4-year college, and I was just starting college. And she hooked up with me pretty aggressively. Moved into my house, and I was taking care of it. Even though I'm like working in restaurants, trying to studying in the evenings, trying to get ready to start going to school, trying to get financial aid and stuff like that. But it was so awesome that this girl that I had this terrible crush on, that we were together, man, and I was like so in love with her. I was just like really having a great time. And then she was like, well, I gotta change up, it's like you're not making enough money. It's like, well, I'll make more money, just give me a chance. I'm gonna get a good salary. She's like, no, I'll stay here and live with you, and we can keep having a relationship. But when I get the guy, that I'm gonna go off with or whatever, then I'm gonna split. And like she goes out, she's like going out on dates. I changed the lock on the door, so she comes back from her date or whatever, and her stuff is outside. I that's how awful I felt. I was like, I did that, but then I was like, oh no, please come back to me. She never spoke to me again, right? She changed the phone number, completely cut me out, wouldn't speak to me. Just very, very, very terrible experience. I thought I was going to die. I was trying to read books, some philosophy books or something like that. Made me feel better. I went to the bookstore at Georgia State University and I got Schopenhauer. It's like, yeah, this is awful. I feel worse, So I went to the bookstore again. I got Nietzsche, Thus Spake Zarathustra, right? I was like, I really want to kill myself reading this garbage, It's awful. And then I went back and I was looking for some Viking saga and or some kind of Viking, fun stuff or whatever. And I saw the Penguin Portable Viking Library Rabelais, Samuel Putnam translation. And I was like, this looks like a froggy stuff, it looks like French. And I grab it, changed my life. It's the greatest thing, funniest thing, the most horrific life of the great Gargantua. And I read that and I recovered and stuff. So years and years go by, right? And many girlfriends and relationships, and finally I get a call from her. What she did is like, when she left me, some older guy, much older, she's like 24, and he's like 44, and he ditched his family, hooked up with her, had 3 kids with her. All these years go by. 2 of those sons are full grown, and they got 1 daughter that's still not of age. And she was shocked and amazed that her husband ditched her and ran off with a young girl. And she's like calling me, like, we're gonna get back together or something like that. It's like, well, Derek, yeah, I'm in China. I live in China. I don't know if at the time I didn't think I would ever come back, but it was an amazing experience because I realized, I really don't love this person. That the person that I thought I loved, it was sort of an illusion or something like that. It's not real. She was just using me and all that stuff. And I after so many years, there's no feeling left whatsoever. I just thought it was really, it's like, well, this guy, yeah, I don't know, you can see it as kind of a reproductive thing where, it could be just instinct at play that, the more viable offspring are going to come from a younger girl, and that once your wife is past the age of having children, you're gonna swap her out for another one. So when she was 24 or something like that, she got this 44-year-old guy, raised 3 kids, right? And then he's like, okay, just like he did when he hooked up with her, and she was talking to me. She's like, I cannot believe he would do that. People would. It's shameless, But you can imagine, you don't want to. Who wants to be married to that? That's awful. So you have enough experiences like that. Let me see what you have enough experiences like that, and you're just not even attracted to. To American women anymore. They just don't even look good anymore. Right, so I dated usually after I dated pretty seriously, I guess, one Irish girl, but she was born in the United States, but she was she was brought up by a family that was very IRA or whatever like that. They had fled. Her grandparents had been under death threats from the UBF and paramilitaries and stuff like that. UFF and UBF or whatever had a warrant out on them, and they had to flee Ireland. So that's why they were in the United States, right? So their granddaughter was really indoctrinated in that way. And I had just been in a 2-year relationship with a girl from England, so. Yeah, but what's amazing to me, and this is coming back around to where this all started with my first marriage with this Mongolian girl, is even though she was Mongolian, the relationship dynamic was still like Ren and Stimpy. I was Stimpy, she was Ren Hoek, and very weird. But I was shocked, after we had been married for several years, all this fascist ideology was coming out of her. And this is an interesting story. She basically in China, especially if your parents are in military equipment scientist or whatever like that, and you've got family members that are very reputable party officials, you can get away with a lot. So she basically did nothing. I saw her transcript from college at Beijing University. It was just like D's, you know, and I didn't know at the time, but basically D is the lowest that they give you if you're going to play that kind of game. But her plan was to be, you know, like a real-time translator of Russian. So her undergraduate degree, she's studying all this Russian stuff, and in graduate school, she her dream, you know, was that she was going to go and live in Russia, and that she would become a translator, you know, a real-time translator, like working for the government or something like that, a very high official position. But with her, the way her conduct had been, she couldn't get a letter of introduction or recommendation to a graduate school from anybody. And you know, as I had gradually more and more deeper conversations with her over the course of our marriage, she dreamed of, she was like, I just want to join the American military and kill Russians, you know, kill all the Russians, you know, spy on them and kill, you know. And I'm like, man, the Russians, yeah, it's like, wow, that's a very intense, you know, kind of, it's like you studied Russian stuff when you were in college, right? And you're dreaming of going and working to help Chinese people and Russian people translate or whatever like that. And because of your conduct, you know, you were not able to get that graduate school position, and you want Russians to die? But yeah, she yeah, you know, it's kind of like deep, but you know, you hate to say Mongolian, you know, but it's sort of like the Freudian death drive, like it's either my way or Armageddon. All right, so professional name, what's going on, man? I'm just getting ready to get started. We should get on some on Discord together, or have you? You know, my Discord is the Real Mystic Mask. Have we added each other on Discord? Because we could get on like a Discord call. A lot of people say I'm really good on the 2 versus 2 with my support mix, but yeah. I'm just talking about my live. I'm not ready to I feel like I'm gonna start sneezing. Oh no. Let me see if anybody's out here. Like Walking Dead. I have some kind of, I think it's a food allergy or something like that. But it just hits me, you know, every now and then, like after a meal or something. And I may, actually, yeah, I'll turn this off.
Finished flying on vehicle and apply for gas station. Zo zit overdoen zo'n Angels inbound tanker.
Warriors. His mortal remains were transported to Odessa.
147. Mission brief, we didn't receive that yet, mission brief.
Tiger will come.
Of Falcon and June, the Christian states were at the highest degree of their prosperity. Towards the end of his reign they showed a tendency to decline. Baldwin III, 13 years of age, succeeded his father, and Queen Melusine became regent of the kingdom. Thus the reins of government fell from the weak and powerless hands of an old man into those of a woman and a child. Parties soon sprung up around the throne. The clergy, the knights, the barons, even the people took a dangerous part in affairs of state, and the authority of the prince, which hitherto had been but that of the general of an army, lost under the regency of Queen Melusine the consideration and splendor it had derived from victory. The government insensibly assumed the turbulent form of a republic, and in the political relations which the Christians held at this period with the Saracens, 257, the latter believed that several chiefs were at the head of the kingdom of Jerusalem. Baldwin did not wait for the period of his majority to be crowned king, being scarcely 14 years old, when, in the presence of the barons and the clergy, he received the sword 258, with which he was to defend religion and justice. The ring, the symbol of faith, the scepter and the crown, marks of dignity and power, and the apple or globe, image of the earth and the kingdom he was called upon to govern. Young, Baldwin already displayed courage above his age. In the very first days of his reign he achieved a glorious expedition beyond the Jordan, in which he gained possession of the Valley of Moses. But he had not experience enough to know what enemies he ought to attack or what allies he ought to defend. On his return from the expedition of the Jordan he undertook an unjust and unfortunate war, the presage of a sad future for the kingdom of Jerusalem. An Armenian, who governed the city of Bosra in the name of the Sultan of Damascus, came to Jerusalem to offer to deliver up to the Christians the place which he commanded, and the barons and principal people were convoked to hear his proposals. The wiser part of the assembly referred to the alliance made with the Saracens of Damascus. The promises of an unknown soldier appeared to them to have no security, and to inspire no confidence. They said the kingdom of Jerusalem did not want for enemies to combat or conquests to attempt. It was their duty to attack the most formidable and protect the others as useful auxiliaries. This advice, which was the most reasonable, was that which obtained the smallest number of suffrages. Wonders were related of the country they were about to conquer. Basra was the capital of Upper Arabia. All the riches of that country appeared already to belong to the Christians, and all who opposed a conquest so brilliant and so easy were accused of treason. They deliberated in the midst of tumult, 259, and the cries of a misled multitude smothered the voice of reason and prudence. The council of the barons and the principal people decided that an expedition, upon which so many hopes were built, should be undertaken. The Christian army was soon on its march, and across the mountains of Libanus. When it arrived in the territory of Damascus, its first conflict was with the Saracens gathered together to oppose its passage. After sustaining several severe encounters, the Christians succeeded in gaining the country called Traconite, where they found nothing but flames burnt up by the ardent rays of the sun. The roads were difficult, and the locusts, having fallen into the wells and cisterns, had poisoned all the waters. The inhabitants, concealed in subterranean caverns, laid ambushes in all directions for the Christian army, whilst the Mussulman archers, planted upon all the hills and declivities, left the warriors of Jerusalem not a moment's repose. The misfortunes of the army, it is William of Tyre who speaks, increased every day, and they were poured upon the Christians such a quantity, and as it were, continually, of all sorts of arrows, that they appeared to descend upon them like hail or heavy rain upon houses covered with slates and tiles, men and beasts being stuck all over with them. Nevertheless, the hope of winning a rich city sustained the courage of the Christian soldiers, and enabled them to brave all these perils. But when they arrived within sight of Basra, it was announced to them that the wife of the Armenian commandant had called the garrison to arms, and that she was prepared to defend the city which her husband had promised to give up to the king of Jerusalem.
That was where I left off.
This unexpected news at once
Just
spread
that spot.
consternation and discouragement through the Christian army. The knights and barons, struck with the misfortunes that threatened the Christian soldiers, pressed the king to abandon his army and save his person and the cross of Christ. Young Baldwin rejected the advice of his faithful barons and insisted upon sharing all their perils. As soon as the order for retreat was given, the Mussulmans, with loud cries, set out in pursuit of the Christians. The soldiers of Jerusalem closed their ranks and marched in silence, sword in hand, bearing away their wounded and dead. The Saracens, who could not shake or break through their enemy, and who, in their pursuit, found no trace of carnage, believed they were actually fighting against men of iron. The region which the Christians were traversing was covered with heath, thistles, and other plants dried by the heat of the summer. The Saracens set fire to these. The wind bore the flames and smoke towards the Christian army, and the French marched over a burning plain, with clouds of smoke, ashes, and dust floating over and around them. William of Tyre, in his history, compares them to Smith, to such a degree were their clothes and their faces blackened by the fire which devoured the plain. The knights, the soldiers, and the people who followed the army, gathered in a crowd around the Bishop of Nazareth, who bore the word of the true cross, and conjured him with tears to put an end by his prayers to calamities they were no longer able to bear. The Bishop of Nazareth, touched by their despair, raised the cross, imploring the mercy of heaven, and, at the moment the direction of the wind was changed. The flames and smoke which desolated the Christians were immediately wafted against the Mussulmans. The Franks pursued their march, persuaded that God had wrought a miracle to save them. A knight, whom they had never before seen, mounted on a white horse, and bearing a red standard, preceded the Christian army, and conducted it out of danger.
Oh
The
no.
people and the soldiers took him for an angel from heaven, and his miraculous presence reanimated their strength and their courage. At length the army of Baldwin, after having undergone all sorts of misery, returned to Jerusalem, where the inhabitants rejoiced at its arrival, singing these words from the Scriptures: "Let us give ourselves up to joy, for that people that was dead is resuscitated. It was lost, and behold here it is found again." But whilst the inhabitants of Jerusalem were rejoicing at the return of the warriors, the Christian states lost one of their most important places, and experienced an irreparable misfortune. Zengi, Umar, Caliph of Baghdad and all true Muslims considered as the buckler and the support of Islamism, extended his empire from Mosul to the frontiers of Damascus, and was continuing without intermission the course of his victories and conquests. The Christians need no effort to stop the progress of so redoubtable a power. Zengi, who united with bravery all the resources of a skillful policy, left them in a deceitful security, and determined only to awaken them from their long sleep when he had it in his power to give a mortal blow to their empire. He knew, by experience, that nothing was more fatal to the Christians than too long a repose. The Franks, who owed everything to their arms, were almost always weakened by peace, and when not fighting against the Saracens, generally fell out among themselves. The Kingdom of Jerusalem had two formidable barriers, the Principality of Antioch and the County of Edessa. Raymond the Fighters defended the Orontes from the invasion of the Saracens, and old Joselinda, Courtenay had been for a long time the terror of the infidels on the banks of Euphrates. But he was recently dead. He had fought to his last breath, and even on his bed of death made his arms and his bravery respected. Jocelyn was besieging a castle near Aleppo when a tower fell down near him and covered him with its ruins. He was transported in a dying state to Edessa, and as he lay languishing on his bed, expecting nothing but death, it was announced to him that the Sultan of Iconium had laid siege to one of his strong places. Upon which he sent for his son and commanded him to go instantly and attack the enemy. Young Jocelyn hesitated and represented to his father that he had not a sufficient number of troops to meet the Turks. The old warrior, who had never acknowledged the existence of obstacles, was determined before he died to leave an example to his son, and caused himself to be borne in a litter at the head of the soldiers. As they approached the besieged city, he was informed that the Turks had retired, whereupon he ordered his litter to stop, raised his eyes towards heaven as if to return thanks for the flight of the Saracens, and expired surrounded by his faithful warriors. His mortal remains were transported to Edessa, the inhabitants of which city came out to meet and join the funeral procession, which presented a most affecting spectacle. Here were to be seen the mourning soldiers, bearing the coffin of their chief, and their whole people lamenting the loss of their support and defender, and celebrating the last victory of a Christian hero. Old Jocelyn died deploring the fate of Edessa, about to be governed by a weak and pusillanimous prince. For from his childhood the son of Courtenay had been addicted to drunkenness and debauchery. In an age in the country in which these vices were sufficiently common, the excesses of young Jocelyn had frequently scandalized the Christian warriors. As soon as he was master, he quitted the city of Edessa, to take up his abode to Vessel, a delicious retreat on the banks of the Euphrates. There, entirely abandoned to his vicious inclinations, he neglected the pay of his troops and the fortifications of his forts, equally heedless of the cares of government and the menaces of the Saracens. Zengi had been for a length of time watching for a favorable opportunity of surprising the city of Edessa. As this conquest would not only flatter his pride and ambition, but would render him dear to all the disciples of Muhammad. In order to retain Jocelyn in his fancied security, the Prince of Mosul aimed to make war against the Saracens. But at the moment he was supposed to be most busily engaged in an attack upon several Muslim castles in the east of Mesopotamia, he appeared at the head of a formidable army before the walls of Edessa. 216, a great number of Kurds and Turkmens, wandering and barbarous tribes, had joined his standard, attracted by the hopes of a rich booty. At the first signal given by Zengi, the city was surrounded on all sides. 7 enormous wooden towers were raised, higher than the ramparts. Numbers of formidable machines unceasingly battered the walls, or hurled into the city stones, javelins, and inflatable ladders. Whilst the foundations of the towers of the fortifications were being undermined by the infidels. The walls, which were only supported by slide and fixed posts, were falling to pieces, and, covering the earth with ruins, seemed ready to offer an easy passage to the Muslim soldiers. when on the point to give the signal for destruction, the fierce Muslims stopped and summoned the city to surrender. The sight of the death which threatened them did not at all weaken the courage of the inhabitants, and they answered that they would all perish sooner than give up the Christian city to the infidels. They exhorted each other to merit the crown of martyrdom. "Let us not fear," said they. "These stones launched against our towers and our houses. He who made the firmament and created legions of angels defends us against his enemies, or prepares us an abode in heaven." Animated by such discourses, the inhabitants of Edessa exerted themselves to destroy the towers and works of the besiegers, the hopes of being succored, redoubling their zeal and courage. They expected, says an Armenian author, assistance from a nation which they called the Valiant, and every day looked to see, from the height of their walls, the standards of the victorious Franks. The hoped for succors were vainly expected. When Jocelyn learned the danger of his capital, he aroused himself from his sloth, and sent information of it to Raymond of Poitiers and the Queen Regent of Jerusalem. But the Prince of Antioch, who disliked Jocelyn, refused to assist Edessa, and the troops of Jerusalem, although set forward on their march, could not arrive in time. Jocelyn ought to have devoted himself to repair the consequences of his faults, but he had not the courage to seek death under the walls of a city he could not save, and whose defense he had neglected. On the 28th day of the siege, several towers fell down with a horrible crash, and Zengi at once ordered his army to enter that place. To paint the frightful scenes of this last attack, I must borrow the words of a contemporary author. The moment at which the sun began to shine above the horizon appeared like a night illumined by the fires of the storm. As soon as the ramparts and towers fell, all the city was filled with terror. Nevertheless, the defenders of Edessa thought not, for a moment, of flight, but all joined in the cry of the brave, conquer or die. Some employed themselves in the dropping of the walls, whilst others boldly flew to meet the enemy. The clergy, clothed in helmet and cuirass, marching at their head. The bishops, bearing each a cross in his hands, bestowed their benedictions on the people, and animated them to the fight. The enemy advanced uttering frightful cries. Even amidst the din of the general assault, the voices of the Saracen heralds at arms were heard, encouraging the soldiers, and promising the pillage of the city to the conquerors. Then, to employ the expression of an Armenian poor, the pusillanimous were seen shedding torrents of tears, whilst the brave swiftness of the stroke of the saber rushed amidst the ranks of the Muslims. Neither prodigies of valor nor the last efforts of despair could save the city or its inhabitants. A great part of the Muslim army was already in the place, and although crossed the steps of the conquerors, fell beneath the sword. Most of those who sought safety in the citadel found death under its ramparts, and were trampled upon and stifled by the crowd. The city of Edessa presented, everywhere, the most lamentable scenes. Some fell whilst flying, and died, crushed to death, by the feet of the horses, whilst others, hastening to the succor of their friends and neighbors, were themselves slaughtered by the barbarians. Neither the weakness of a timid sex, nor age on the brink of the tomb, neither the cries of infants, nor the screams of young, those who sought safety in the arms, or beneath the garments of their parents, could abate the rage of the Saracens. They whom the sword had not yet reached, looked for nothing but death. Some crept to the churches to await it, and died embracing the altars of Christ, whilst others, yielding to their despair, remained motionless in their houses, where they were massacred with their families. The citadel soon surrendered, the soldiers who defended it only asking their lives. But, notwithstanding the capitulation, many were put to the sword. A great part of the priests who had survived the carnage were condemned to slavery. An Armenian patriarch was stripped of his vestments, dragged through the streets, and beaten with rods. Matthew of Edessa, one of the most celebrated historians of Armenia, fell under the sword of the Muslims. Hugh, a Latin archbishop, having endeavored to escape, was, with all his clergy, slaughtered by the infidels. His treasures, which he carried with him, and which might had been usefully employed for the defense of the city, became the prey of the enemy. Pious historians impute the fall of Edessa to the avarice of this prelate, and appear to believe that he was punished in another world for having preferred his gold to the safety of his fellow citizens. 261. When the Muslims had become masters of the citadel, their priests ascended the steeples of the churches to proclaim these words, "O Muhammad, Prophet of heaven, we have gained a great victory in thy name. We have destroyed the people that worship stone, and coins of blood have been shed to make thy law triumph." After this proclamation, the Saracens redoubled their excesses. The Ghazis or conquerors satiated themselves with blood. The dead bodies were mutilated, and their heads sent to Baghdad, and even to Khorasan. But all who remained alive in the city of Edessa were treated as a flock of animals, and sold in the public places. The Christians, loaded with chains, after having lost their property, their country, and their liberty, had the still further grief of seeing their religion, which was all they had left, to console them in their misfortunes, made a subject of ridicule by the infidels. The churches were plundered of their ornaments, and the sanctuary became the scene of the most shocking debaucheries. Many of the faithful whom the horrors of war had spared, could not support the sight of such profanations, and died with despair. 262.
Hey, Ninja
Thus
Sauce,
the
what's going on? I haven't seen you in a while.
ramparts, and position on two mountains, rendered one of the strongest places in Asia, fell into the power
Shalom.
of the Muslims. The traditions of religion and history carry back its origin to the highest antiquity. Narcissus, in a pathetic elegy, deplores the fall of its celebrated city, and makes itself speak of its ancient splendor. 263, I was, says she, as a queen in the midst of her court. 60 towns standing around me formed my train. My numerous children passed their days in pleasures. The fertility of my fields, the freshness of my limpid waters, and the beauty of my palaces were admired. My altars, loaded with treasures, shed their splendor far, and appeared to be the abode of angels. I surpassed in magnificence the proudest cities of Asia, and I was as a celestial edifice built upon the bosom of the earth. The conquest of Edessa exalted the pride of the Saracens. The Caliphate then ordered that the barbarous destroyer of the Christians should be named in the public prayers of the Fridays, and that the whole Muslim people should offer up thanks to heaven for his victories. Zengi left some troops in the conquered city, and pursued the course of his triumphs. But fortune did not permit him to finish that which he had begun. He was besieging the castle of
Could use
Jabir
it.
in Mesopotamia
There, okay.
when he was assassinated by some slaves whom ill treatment had irritated. The news of his death consoled the Christians for their defeats, and they expressed a joy as immoderate as if they had beheld the whole power of the Muslims fall at once. But this joy was of very short duration, for abundance of new enemies and new misfortunes soon followed to overwhelm them. Jocelyn, who had taken advantage of the troubles which ensued upon the death of the Prince of Mosul to retake the city of Edessa, ill-guarded by the Muslims, found himself unexpectedly besieged by Nuruddin, the second son of Zeki. Nuruddin had received, as his share of the heritage of his father, the principality of Al-Bakr, and was eager to signalize his zeal against the Christians. Jocelyn and his companions, who had surprised the city of Edessa amidst the darkness of night, were wanting in machines of war to besiege
come
and
here, killing
get
us.
possession of the citadel. When the city was invested by the Prince of Aleppo, the Christian warriors who were placed between the garrison of the fortress and the Muslim army saw at once the danger of their position. As in desperate circumstances, 1,000 resolutions are, by turns, formed and rejected. Whilst they deliberated, the enemy pressed and frightened them. There soon remained no safety for them in a city which they had entered as conquerors. And, after having braved death to get possession of it, they decided upon facing equal perils to get out of it. The soldiers of Jocelyn, consisting of Christians who had gathered to the city, and of a small number of inhabitants who had survived the massacre of their brethren, had now nothing left but their endeavors to escape the barbarity of the Muslims. They made their preparations for flight in silence. The gates were opened in the middle of the night, and everyone bearing away that the chief, the most valuable, a weeping crowd pressed along the streets. Already a great number of these unhappy fugitives had passed the gates of the city, headed by the warriors commanded by Jocelyn, and had advanced into the plain where the Saracens were encamped. When the garrison of the citadel, warned by the tumult, knew the sortie, and, uniting themselves with the soldiers of Nureddin, who hastened towards the city, gained possession of the gates by which the Christians were issuing. Many severe conflicts were here maintained, of which darkness increased the wars. The Christians succeeded in opening themselves a passage, and spread themselves about in the neighboring fields. They, who carried arms united in battalions, and endeavored to pass through the camp of the enemy, whilst others, separated from the troop of warriors, went on at hazard, wandered about the plains, and everywhere, found death following their footsteps. Whilst relating the events of this horrible night, William of Tyre cannot restrain his tears. Oh, disastrous night! Isaiah story in the Wolfridge, dawn of hell, day without pity, day of misfortune which rose upon the children of a city formerly worthy of envy. In Edessa, out of Edessa, nothing was heard but cries of death. The warriors who had formed battalions, after having pierced through the army of the infidels, were pursued as far as the banks of the Euphrates, and the roads were strewed with their remains, their arms, and their baggage. Only 1,000 of them succeeded in gaining the city of Samosata, which received them within its walls, and deplored their misfortunes, without being able to avenge them. History relates that more than 30,000 Christians were slaughtered by the soldiers of Zengi and Nureddin. 60,000 were made prisoners and dragged out their lives in misery and slavery. Nureddin in his vengeance did not spare either the ramparts or buildings of a rebel city. He razed the towers, the citadel, and the churches of Edessa to the ground. He banished all the Christians from it, and left nothing but a few mendicants to dwell amidst the ruins of their country. Zengi had been considered as a saint, as a warrior beloved by Muhammad, for having conquered the city of Edessa. The blood-stained expedition of Nureddin rendered him dear to the Muslims, contributed much to the extension of his renown and his power, and already the Armans and the poets promised to his arms the much more glorious conquest of Jerusalem. The inhabitants of Jerusalem and other Christian cities shed tears of despair on learning the following destruction of Edessa. Sinister presages adding much to the terror which the news from the banks of the Euphrates inspired them with. Thunder fell upon the churches of the Holy Sepulchre in Mount Shur. A comet with shining hair was seen in the heavens and spread general consternation. Several other signs appeared, says William of Tyre, contrary to custom, and out of time, indicative of future things. As a crowning misfortune, Adolphe, Chancellor of Jerusalem, was taken by force to the siege of Tyre, and scandal prevailed in the sanctuary. All the faithful of the East were persuaded that heaven had declared itself against them, and that horrible calamities were about to fall upon the Christian people. Book 6. Second Crusade. AD 1142 to 1148. The Christian colonies, threatened by the Muslims, called upon the princes of Europe to assist them. The bishop of Kavala in Syria, accompanied by a great number of priests and knights, repaired to Waterloo, where the sovereign pontiff then resided. The recitals of the Christian embassy not only caused tears to flow from the eyes of the chief of the faithful. The misfortunes of Edessa and the impending dangers of Jerusalem excited universal commiseration and dread. Cries of alarm were raised throughout Europe. 45 years had passed away since the deliverance of the Holy Sepulchre, yet the minds of men were not at all changed, and eagerly, as at the first crusade, they flew to arms. In this instance it was principally the voice of Saint Bernard that excited the nations and kings of Christendom to range themselves under the banners of the cross. Born of a noble family of Burgundy, Saint Bernard, whilst yet in the dawn of manhood, had, with 30 relations and companions who his discourses and his example 264 influenced, secluded himself in the monastery of St. He was sent 2 years after to Clairvaux, at an unknown retreat, which he vivified with his presence, and rendered one of the most celebrated monasteries of Christendom. Many of the most learned doctors consulted the wisdom of the abbot of Clairvaux, and several councils bowed to his decisions. By the power of his eloquence alone he humbled the anti-Pope Leo in Christ Innocent II. In the chair of St. Peter, Pope Innocent III and Abbot Sugar were his disciples. Prelates, princes, and monarchs glorified themselves in following his counsels, believing that God fell by his mouth. When the ambassadors from the East arrived in Europe, Louis VII
Fearsome.
had just ascended the throne of France.
Two-fisted
The reign
godman.
of this young monarch began
thought it was
under the
dead.
most happy auspices. Most of the great vassals who had revolted against the royal authority had laid down their arms and renounced their pretensions. By a marriage with the daughter of William IX, Louis had added the Duchy of Aquitaine to his kingdom. France, in her enlarged condition, had nothing to fear from neighboring states, and while civil wars were desolating both England and Germany, she nourished in peace under the administration of Sugar. Peace was not for a moment disturbed but by the unjust pretensions of the Pope and by the intrigues of Bigot, Count of Champagne, who took advantage of the ascendancy he had over the clergy to direct the thunders of the Church against his sovereign. Louis resisted the attempts of the Holy See with firmness, and was determined to punish a rebellious and dangerous vassal. Urged on by a spirit of blind revenge, he carried fire and sword through the states of Bigot. He besieged Vitry, was himself first in the assault, and put to the sword every inhabitant to be met within the city. A great number of persons of all ages had taken refuge in a church, hoping to find the altar a secure asylum against the anger of a Christian prince. But Louis set fire to the church, and 1,300 people perished in the flames. An action so barbarous spread terror among the nation whom Louis was appointed to render happy. When he returned from this expedition to his capital, the people received him in melancholy silence. His ministers allowed him to read their regret in the dejection of their countenances. And Saint Bernard, like another Ambrosius, boldly compelled him to hear the complaints of religion and outraged humanity. In an eloquent letter, he represented to the monarch the country, desolated, and pointed to the church despised and trampled under foot. I will fight for her, he said, to the death. But instead of bucklers and swords, I will employ the arms which become me my tears, and my prayers to God. At the voice of the holy abbot, Louis became sensible of his error, and the dread of the anger of heaven made such a mighty impression upon his mind that he sank into a deep and alarming depression. He believed he saw the hand of God ready to strike him. He renounced all pleasures, and abandoned even the care of his authority, in order to devote himself to grief and tears. The abbot of Clairvaux, who had awakened his remorse, was obliged to calm his spirits and reanimate his courage, by representing to him the great mercy of God. The King of France recovered from his remorseless dejection. But as in the opinion of his age great crimes could only be absolved by a voyage to the Holy Land, his earnest desire to expiate the tragical death of the inhabitants of Vitry made him form the resolution of going to combat against the infidels. Louis VII convoked an assembly at Bourges, at which he made his project known to the principal nobility and the clergy. Godfrey, Bishop of Limbers, applauded his zeal, and in a pathetic discourse deplored the captivity of Edessa and the dangers and disasters of the Eastern Christians. His eloquence moved his auditors. But the oracle of the assembly, he who held all hearts in his hand, had not yet spoken. Whether that he was yet not convinced of the utility of the crusade, or that he was desirous of giving it more solemnity, Saint Bernard advised the King of France to consult the Holy See before he undertook anything. This advice was generally approved of. Louis sent ambassadors to Rome, and resolved to convoke a new assembly as soon as he should have received the answer of the sovereign pontiff. Eugenius III, who then filled the chair of St. Peter, had already in several of his letters solicited the assistance of the faithful against the Saracens. The Holy See had never had stronger motives for the preaching of a crusade. A spirit of sedition and heresy was beginning to insinuate itself among the people, and even among the clergy of the West, threatening at the same time the power of the popes and the doctrines of the church. Eugenius had to contend against the troubles excited by Arnold of Brescia. And nothing was talked of in the capital of the Christian world but rebuilding the capital and substituting for the pontifical authority that of the consuls and tribunes of ancient Rome. In such a state of things, a great event like that of a crusade was likely to turn men's minds from dangerous novelties and make them rally round the sanctuary. The sovereign pontiff could not avoid seeing in Holy War the double advantage of defending Jerusalem against the enterprises of the Saracens, and the church and himself against the attacks of heretics and innovators. Eugenius congratulated the King of France on his pious determination, and by his letters again exhorted all Christians to assume the cross and take up arms, promising them the same privileges and the same rewards that Urban II had granted to the warriors of the First Crusade. Detained in Italy, where he was engaged in appeasing the troubles of Rome, he regretted not
Emperor
being
Mac,
able,
what's up?
as Urban had done, to cross the Alps and reanimate the zeal of the faithful by his presence and his discourses.
What's going on, bro?
But he confided to Saint Bernard the honorable mission of preaching the crusade in France and Germany. After having received the approbation of the Holy See, Louis convoked a new assembly at Vézelay, a little city of Burgundy. And the reputation of Saint Bernard and the letters addressed by the Pope to all Christendom drew to this
Alright.
assembly a great number
I
of
presume
nobles,
we have met
knights,
before.
prelates, and men of all conditions. On Palm Sunday, after having invoked the Holy Ghost, all who had come to hear the Abbot of Clairvaux repaired to the side of a hill just without the gates of the city. A large tribune was erected, in which the king in his royal robes, and Saint Bernard in the humble costume of a Cenobite, were saluted by the acclamations of an immense multitude. The Order of the Crusade first read the letters of the sovereign pontiff, and then spoke to his auditors of the taking of Edessa by the Saracens, and of the desolation of the holy places. He showed them the universe plunged in terror on learning that God had begun to desert his beloved land. 265. He represented to them the city of Ishin as imploring their succor. Christ is ready to immolate himself a second time for them, and the heavenly Jerusalem opening on his
Listen,
gates
help
to
over here. I
receive the
got like
glorious
4 guys
waters
on
of the
my mind.
faith. You cannot
Help.
know, said he to them, we
Thank
live
you.
in a period of chastisement and ruin. The enemy of mankind has caused the breath of corruption to fly over all regions. We behold nothing but unpunished wickedness. The laws of men or the laws of religion have no longer sufficient power to check depravity of manners and the triumph of the wicked. The demon of heresy has taken possession of the chair of truth, and God has sent forth his malediction upon his sanctuary. Oh, ye who listen to me! Hasten then to appease the anger of heaven, but no longer implore his goodness by vain complaints. Clothe not yourselves in sackcloth, but cover yourselves with your impenetrable bucklers. The din of arms, the dangers, the labors, the fatigues of war are the penances that God now imposes on you. Hasten then to expiate your sins by victories over the infidels, and let the deliverance of the holy places be the reward of your repentance. These words of the orator excited the greatest enthusiasm in the assembly of the faithful, and, like Urban at the Council of Clermont, Saint Bernard was interrupted by the repeated cries of "It is the will of God. It is the will of God." Then raising his voice, as if he had been the interpreter of the will of heaven, he promised them, in the name of God, success to their holy expedition, and thus continued his discourse. If it were announced to you that the enemy had invaded your cities, your castles, and your lands, had ravished your wives and your daughters, and profaned your temples, which among you would not fly to arms? Well, then, all these calamities, and calamities still greater, have fallen upon your brethren, upon the family of Jesus Christ, which is yours. Why do you hesitate to repair so many evils, to revenge so many outrages? Will you allow the infidels to contemplate in peace the ravages they have committed on Christian people? Remember that their triumph would be a subject for grief to all ages, and an eternal opprobrium upon the generation that has endured it. Yes, the living. God has charged me to announce to you that he will punish them who shall not have defended him against his enemies. Fly then to arms. Let a holy rage animate you in the fight. And let the Christian world resound with these words of the prophet. Cursed be he who does not stain his sword with blood. If the Lord calls you to the defense of his heritage, think not that his hand has lost its power. 266. Could he not send 12 legions of angels, or breathe one word, and all his enemies would crumble away into dust? But God has considered the sons of men to open for them the road to his mercy. His goodness has caused to dawn for you a day of safety, by calling on you to avenge his glory and his name. Christian warriors, he who gave his life for you, today, demands yours in return. These are combats worthy of you, combats in which it is glorious to conquer, and advantageous to die. Illustrious knights, generous defenders of the cross, remember the example of your fathers who conquered Jerusalem, and whose names are inscribed in heaven. Abandon then the things that perish to gather eternal cause, and conquer a kingdom which has no end. All the barons and knights applauded the eloquence of Saint Bernard, and were persuaded that he had but uttered the will of God. Louis VII, deeply moved by the words he had heard, cast himself, in the presence of all the people, at the feet of Saint Bernard and demanded the cross. Clothed with his prepared sign, he himself addressed the assembly of the faithful, to exhort them to follow his example. In his discourse he showed them the impious Philistine casting opprobrium upon the house of David, and reminded them of the holy determination which God himself had inspired in him. He invoked, in the name of the Christians of the East, the aid of that generous nation of which he was the chief. Of that nation which would not endure shame when directed at itself or its allies, and which always carried terror amidst the enemies of its worship or its glory. At this discourse the whole auditory was melted in tears. The touching piety of the monarch persuaded all who had not been convinced by the eloquence of Saint Bernard. The hill upon which this vast multitude was assembled resounded for a length of time with the cries of "It is the will of God! It is the will of God!" and "The cross! The cross!" Eleanor of Guienne, who accompanied Louis, received, as his wife, the sign of the cross from the hands of the Abbot of Clairvaux. Alfonso, Count of Saint Gilles de Toulouse, Henry, son of Thibaut, Count of Champagne, Thierry, Count of Flanders, William, of Nevers, Renaud, Count de Teniers, Yves, Count de Soissons, William, Count de Penthièvre, William, Count de Varens, Archambault de Bourbon, Emperor de Coucy, Hugh de Lusignan, the Count de Dreux, brother of the king, his uncle the Count de Morin, and a crowd of barons and knights followed the example of Louis and Eleanor. Several bishops, among whom history remarks Simon, Bishop of Noyon, Godfrey, Bishop of Lingers, Alain, Bishop of Arras, and Arnold, Bishop of Lisieux, throned themselves at the feet of Saint Bernard, taking the oath to fight against the infidels. The crosses which the Abbot of Clairvaux had brought were not sufficient for the great number who claimed them. He tore his vestments to make more, and several of those who surrounded him, in their turns, tore their clothes into strips in order to satisfy the impatience of all the faithful whom he had inflamed with desire for the holy war. To preserve the memory of this day, Hans, Abbot of Vézelay, founded, upon the hill where the knights and barons had assembled, a church, which he dedicated to the Holy Cross. 267, the tribune, from the top of which Saint Bernard had preached the crusade, remained there a long time, the object of the veneration of the faithful. After the assembly of Vézelay, the Abbot of Clairvaux continued to preach the crusade in the cities and neighboring countries. France soon resounded with the fame of the miracles by which God seemed to authorize and consecrate, in some sort, his mission. He was everywhere considered as the messenger of heaven, as another Moses, who was to conduct the people of God. All the Christians were persuaded that the success of the enterprise depended upon Saint Bernard, and in an assembly held at Chartres, in which were met several barons and princes, illustrious by their exploits, it was resolved by unanimous consent to give him the command of the holy war. The Crusaders, they said, could never fail to be victorious under the laws of a leader to whom God appeared to have confided his omnipotence. The abbot of Clairvaux, who remembered the example of Peter the Hermit, refused the perilous employment with which they desired to honor him. He was even so much terrified by the pressing entreaties of the barons and knights, that he addressed himself to the Pope, and conjured the sovereign pontiff not to abandon him to the fantasies of men. The Pope answered St. Bernard that he only need arm himself with the sword of the Word of God, and content himself with sounding the evangelical trumpet to announce the war. The abbot of Clairvaux employed himself in nothing thereafter but his mission, and he acquitted himself with so much zeal, and his preachings produced such an extraordinary, and I will venture to add, so unfortunate an effect, that they depopulated cities and countries. He wrote to Portigenes, the villages and the castles are deserted, and there are none left, but widows and orphans, whose husbands and parents are still living. While St. Bernard was thus preaching the crusade in the provinces of France, a German monk, named Ridolfi, exhorted the people of the Rhine to massacre the Jews, whom he represented in his vehement discourses as the allies of the Saracens, and the most dangerous enemies of the Christian religion. The abbot of Clairvaux, fearing the effect of these preachings, hastened into Germany to impose silence on the seditious apostle of the Holy War. As the German monk had flattered the passions of the multitude, St. Bernard required all the ascendancy of his virtue and his fame to combat his doctrines. He ventured to raise his voice in the midst of an irritated people, and to make them feel that Christians ought not to persecute Jews, but pray to heaven for their conversion. That it belonged to Christian piety to pardon the weak, and make war against the exalted and proud. The preacher of the crusade at length silenced the turbulent orator, and sent him back to his monastery, reminding him that the duty of monks was not to preach, but to weep. That they ought to consider cities as prisons, and solitude as their paradise. This action of Saint Bernard, 268, which was scarcely observed in his own barbarous age, and which has been turned into ridicule in ours, does honor to his character, and may excuse the extravagant zeal he displayed for a disastrous war. When he arrived in Germany, the Germanic Empire was beginning to breathe after the long trouble that had followed the election of Lothair. Conrad III, clothed with the purple, had just conducted General Diet at Spires. The abbot of Clairvaux repaired thither with the intention of preaching war against the Mussulmans and peace among Christian princes. Saint Bernard pressed the Emperor Conrad several times to take up the cross. He at first exhorted him in private conferences, and afterwards renewed his exhortations in sermons preached in public. Conrad could not make up his mind to take the oath to go and fight against the infidels in Asia, alleging the recent troubles of the German empires. Saint Bernard replied that the Holy See had placed him upon the imperial throne, and that the Pope and the Church would support their work. Whilst you shall defend his heritage, God himself will take care to defend yours. He will govern your people, and your reign will be the object of his love. The more hesitation the emperor felt, the warmer became the zeal and eloquence of Saint Bernard to persuade him. One day, as the orator of the crusade was saying mass before the princes and lords convoked at Spires, all at once he interrupted the service to preach the war against the infidels. Towards the end of his discourse, he transported the imagination of his auditors to the day of judgment, and made them hear the trumpets which were to call all the nations of the earth before the tribunal of God. Jesus Christ, armed with his cross and surrounded by his angels, addressing himself to the Emperor of Germany, recalled to him all the benefits with which he had loaded him, and reproached him with ingratitude. Conrad was so much affected by this vehement apostrophe that he interrupted the speaker, and, with tears in his eyes, cried out, "I know what I owe to Jesus Christ, and I swear to go wherever he shall call me." Then the nobles and the people, who believed they had been witnesses of a miracle, threw themselves on their knees and returned thanks to God for his blessings. Conrad received from the hands of the abbot of Clairvaux the emblem of the Crusaders, together with a flag which was placed upon the altar, and which heaven itself had blessed. A great number of barons and knights assumed the cross in imitation of Conrad, and the diet which had been assembled to deliberate upon the interests of the empire was occupied entirely with the safety of the Christian colonies in Asia. A new diet was convoked in Bavaria, where the letters of Saint Bernard determined a great number of bishops and German nobles to take the cross. Odysseus, Duke of Bohemia, Odoacer, Marquis of Syria, Bernard, Count of Carinthia, Amadeus, Duke of Turin, and the Marquis de Montferrat took the oath to go into the east to fight the Saracens. Among the prelates who enrolled themselves under the banners of the cross, history names the Bishop of Passai, the Bishop of Ratisbon, and the wise Otho of Freisingen, brother of the Emperor, to whom posterity owes a relation of the principal events of this war. The most dear interests, the most tender affections had no power to detain the knights and princes in their countries and homes. Frederick, nephew of the Emperor, who had taken the cross, allowed himself not to be moved by the tears of his aged father, the Duke of Swabia, who died with grief in spite of the consolations of Saint Bernard. A war cry was heard from the Rhine to the Danube. Germany, although so long agitated by its own troubles, found in all parts warriors for the holy expedition. Men of all conditions obeyed the voice of the preacher of the holy war, and followed the example of kings and princes, a thing to be wondered at, says Otho of Freisingen. Thieves and robbers were seen, performing penance, and swearing to shed their blood for Jesus Christ. Every reasonable man, as the same historian, a witness of the changes that were operated in them, plainly perceived the work of God, and was not the less astonished at it. The Germans were so easily persuaded that they came and listened to the abbot of Clairvaux, who preached to them in a language they did not understand, and returned convinced of the truth and holiness of the discourse. The sight of the preacher so much reverence appeared to bestow a marvelous sense upon every one of his words. The miracles, which were attributed to him, and which were performed sometimes in private, sometimes in public, as Otho of Freisingen says, were like a divine language which warmed the most indifferent, and persuaded the most incredulous. Shepherds and laborers abandoned the fields to follow him into towns and cities. When he arrived in a city, all labors were suspended. The war against the infidels, and the prodigies, by which God promised his protection to the soldiers of the cross, became the only business of men of all classes. Sometimes the abbot of Clairvaux assembled the clergy, and preached reform in their manners. Sometimes he addressed the people and animated them against the Saracens. Saint Bernard visited all the cities of the Rhine, from Constance to Maastricht. In each city, say the ancient chronicles, he restored sight to the blind, hearing to the deaf, and cured the lame and the sick. They report 36 miracles performed in one day, at each prodigy the multitude crying out, 269, Jesus Christ, have mercy upon us. All the saints, succor us. The disciples who followed the abbot of Clairvaux could not help regretting that the tumult which was constantly raised upon his passage prevented their seeing several of his miracles. 270, every day an increasing crowd pressed around him. History relates that he was once on the point of being stifled by the multitude which followed his steps, and only owed his safety to the Emperor of Germany, who took him in his arms, and drove back the people, who were impatient to see and touch him whom they regarded as the interpreter and messenger of God. After having set Germany in a blaze with his preaching, and revived the zeal of the countries of Italy by his pathetic letters, Saint Bernard returned to France to announce the success of his mission. His absence had suspended everything, and that multitude of crusaders, upon whom his eloquence had acted so powerfully, appeared to have neither chief, direction, nor rallying point whilst he was not in the midst of them. The King of France and the nobles of the kingdom, assembled at Étampes, had formed no resolution. But the return of Saint Bernard restored life to the councils of the princes and the barons, and made them resume with new ardor the enterprise of the Holy War. When he made, before the lords and prelates, the recital of his journey, and of the prodigies God had effected by his hand, when he spoke of the determination he had induced the Emperor of Germany to form, a determination which he called a miracle of miracles, all hearts expanded with enthusiasm and were filled with hope and joy. At the same time, several ambassadors appeared in the assembly of Itans to announce that their princes had determined to enroll themselves under the banners of the cross. And letters were read from distant countries, by which a great number of foreign lords and barons promised to join the French in their projected expedition against the Saracens. From that period, no doubt was entertained of the happy results of the crusade, and the zeal which was displayed by all the nations of Europe was considered as a manifest expression of the will of heaven. Among the ambassadors who were present at the assembly of Etaples were some from Roger, king of Apulia and Sicily, who offered the Crusaders vessels and provisions, and promised to send his son with them to the Holy Land, if they determined to go by sea. The Sicilian deputies reminded the King of France and his barons of the perfidy of the Greeks towards the Franks in the First Crusade. "You may," said they, "brave the forces of the most powerful nations, but nothing can secure you against the artifices and machinations of a deceitful and perfidious people." The assembly deliberated upon the offers of the King of Sicily, and upon the route it would be most advisable to take. The greater part of the barons, full of confidence in their arms and the protection of God, could not be brought to doubt the faith of the Greeks. The route by sea seemed to offer fewer wonders to their curiosity, and fewer perils for the exercise of their bravery. Besides, the vessels which Roger could furnish would not merely suffice to transport all whom religious zeal would lead to join the holy bands. It was therefore resolved that preference should be given to the route by land. The historian Herodotus speaks with deep regret of this resolution, which proved so fatal to the Crusaders, and about which they had neglected to consult the Holy Ghost. The Sicilian deputies could not conceal their sorrow, and returned to their country, predicting all the misfortunes that would ensue.
All right. Here we go. CPL 27. I'm close. Did I get some tickets? Definitely tickets. 8 of them. Okay, let's go. Where is the Walking Dead? Inquiring minds want to know. Shoot. Turkey. Ooh. Why don't you just come on down here? Let's get this one. Now. I'm gonna have a word with you. Oh, you missed. Oh, this whole deathmatch is a waste. What is this guy? Quackzilla? Go fight somebody else. What's your name? Pay to win. Look at all these gizmos he's got. 365,000 damage. Shoot you in the back. Quackzilla. How about that? What's your name? 365,000 damage. Fool. What else has he got? Let me go get him up. Oh, you got a mini gun? How much fire? How much damage does it do? 459,085. That would do it, John. start this time. Okay. 1, 2, 3. Still.
Speed all after that.
In soon, the assembly of Italians appeared to act under a much better influence when it became necessary to choose the persons who should be entrusted with the government of the kingdom during the pilgrimage of Louis VII. When the barons and the prelates had deliberated upon this important choice, Saint Bernard, who was their interpreter, addressed the king, and, pointing to Abbot Sugar and the Count de Nevers, said, "Sire, there are 2 weapons, and they are enough." It was necessary that this choice of the assembly should obtain the approbation of the king and the suffrages of the people. The Abbot of St. Denis had blessed France with holy peace and had been the author of the glory of 2 reigns. He was opposed to the Crusades, and with Sussex's eulogy, he had preserved his popularity without sharing in the prevailing opinions. Sugar advised the king not to abandon his subjects, and represented to him that his heirs would be much better repaired by a wise administration of the kingdom God had placed him over than by conquests in the east. He who could ever give such advice as this was more worthy than any other to represent his sovereign. But Sugar at first refused an employment of which he plainly saw the burden and the danger. The assembly would not make another choice, and the king himself had recourse to prayers and tears to induce his minister to take his place in the government of the kingdom. The Pope, who arrived a short time after in France, ordered Sugar to yield to the wishes of the monarch, the nobles, and the nation. The sovereign pontiff, in order to facilitate the honorable task which he imposed upon the abbot of St. Denis, lodged beforehand defenders of the church against all who should make any attempts against the legal authority during the absence of the king. The Count de Nevers, who had likewise been pointed out by the assembly of the barons and bishops, declined, as the abbot of St. Denis had done, the dangerous charge which they offered him. When he was warmly pressed to accept the government of the kingdom, he declared that he had made a vow to enter into the order of St. Bruno. Such was the spirit of the age, that this intention was respected as the will of God. And whilst the assembly congratulated themselves upon producing a monarch posted to govern the kingdom, they followed out, astonishing the prince did in eternal farewell of the world, and buried himself in a monastery. From this time preparations for departure were actively commenced, and all the provinces of France and Germany were in motion. The same motives which had armed the companions of Godfrey in the first expedition inflamed the courage of the new crusaders. The Eastern War held up to their ambition the same hopes and the same advantages. The greater part of the people were animated by the never-forgotten remembrance of the conquest of Jerusalem. The relations that this conquest had established between Syria and Europe added still to the zeal and ardor of the soldiers of the cross. There was scarcely a family in the West that did not furnish a defender to the holy places, an inhabitant to the cities of Palestine. The Christian colonies in the East were to the Franks as a new country. Warriors who lived in the cross appeared to be only arming themselves to defend another France, which was dear to all Christians, and which might be called the France of the East. The example of 2 monarchs also necessarily influenced many warriors when ranking themselves under the banners of the crusade. Many of those truly nobles, who were then called Freemen, must have had, as well as Louis VII, numerous guilty violences to expiate. The spirit of chivalry, which was every day making fresh progress, was not a less powerful principle with a nobility purely and entirely warlike. A great number of women, attracted by the example of Eleanor of Guienne, took up the cross and armed themselves with sword and lance. A crowd of knights eagerly followed them, and indeed a species of shame-saint, attached to all who did not go to fight the infidels. History relates that distaffs and spindles were sent to those who would not take arms as an appropriate reproach for their cowardice. The troubadours and trouvers whose songs were so much liked, and who employed themselves in singing the victories of knights over the Saracens, determined to follow into Asia the heroes and the days they had celebrated several troubadours and minstrels were then wanted east to alleviate the tediousness of a long journey. And yet the enthusiasm of the Crusaders did not bear quite the same character as that of the First Crusade. The world was not, in their eyes, filled with those prodigies which proclaim the especial will of heaven. Great phenomena of nature did not work upon the imagination of the pilgrims so vividly. God seemed to have delegated all his power to a single man, who led the people as with by his eloquence and his miracles. Nobody was seen, nobody was heard, but seen or not. Whereas, in the time of Peter, heard orders everywhere about it, and nature seemed charged by God himself to promote the crusade. The extraordinary occurrence of the time was the case which prevailed throughout Europe. 271, as at the approach of the First Crusade, wars between individuals, civil troubles, and public outrage ceased all at once. The departure of the Crusaders was accompanied by less disorder at the setting out of the first expedition. They neither showed the same imprudence in the choice of their leaders, nor the same impatience to march. France and Germany had not to suffer the deprivations of an undisciplined multitude. The First Crusade, some of the armies of which were commanded by princes and knights, and others by adventurers and monks, exhibited all the license and the tumultuous passions that are met within unsettled republics. In the Second Punic War, which was led by two powerful princes, the more regular forms of a monarchy were preserved. The smaller vassals gathered around their lords, and the latter were obedient to the orders of the King of France, or the Emperor of Germany. Such good order in the outset of the Holy enterprise appeared to promise certain victory, and could create no forethought of the disasters which awaited the Christian armies. The city of Metz was the rendezvous of the French Crusaders, and Ratisbon that of the Germans. The roads which led to these cities were covered with pilgrims, marching under the banners of their lords. A great number of warriors also repaired to the ports of Flanders, England, and Italy, where fleets were prepared for the transport of provisions and arms, with crusaders who were patient to arrive in Asia. As the roads to the east were now known, the pilgrims deceived themselves less with regard to the countries they had to pass through. The sovereign pontiff had advised barons and knights not to take with them either dogs or birds for sport. They renounced the luxury of their castles and contented themselves with their arms. 272. They even had the precaution to take with them things that might be required in a distant journey. The Crusaders, but particularly the Germans, carried all sorts of instruments for throwing bridges, cutting down forests, and clearing roads. The greatest difficulty was to find money to defray the expenses of the Holy War. All whom infirmities or particular circumstances detained in Europe were anxious to assist, by their offerings, the enterprise of the crusade. According to the devotion of the times, the greater part of the rich who died without having seen Jerusalem, left by their will assumed for the promotion of pilgrimages to the east. All these pious gifts were, no doubt, considerable, but they could not suffice for the support of a large army. To procure the necessary money, Louis VII had recourse to loans and levied imposts, which were regulated and approved by the sovereign pontiff. Saint Bernard and Peter, the Venerable, had exerted themselves with much courage against the persecution of the Jews. But the abbot of Cluny thought they ought to be punished in that which they held dearest, their wealth, amassed by usury and even by sacrilege. He advised the King of France to take from the Jews the money necessary for the war against the Saracens. It is probable that the advice of Peter the Venerable was not disdained, and that the Jews furnished a considerable part of the expenses of the crusade. The clergy also, who had so much enriched themselves by the First Crusade, were obliged to advance considerable sums for this expedition. The monastery of Fleury loaned 300 silver marks and a large sum in gold. In many other abbeys the vases and church ornaments were sold to purchase arms, and to pay the expenses of a war undertaken for the glory of Christ. The lords and barons followed the example of the King of France. Some pledged or sold their lands, but the greater part made their vassals furnish means for their pilgrimage. The heavy taxes laid upon the people, and particularly the spoliation of the churches, excited many complaints, and began to cool the ardor for the crusade. There was 273, says an ancient historian, neither state, condition, age, nor sex, which was not forced to contribute to the equipment of the king and the princess going with him. Whence followed the discontent of everyone, and innumerable maledictions, as well directed against the king as the troops. Nevertheless Louis VII prepared for his undertaking by acts of devotion. He visited the hospitals, and caused prayers to be put up in all the churches for the success of the crusade. When his departure drew near, he went to St. Denis to take the famous oriflamme, which was borne before the kings of France in battle. The church of St. Denis was at that time decorated with great magnificence. Among the historical monuments which were there collected, the portraits of Godfrey de Bouillon, Tancred, Raymond de Saint-Gilles, and the battles of Dorylean, Antioch, and Ascalon, 274, traced upon the windows of the choir, must have attracted the eyes and fixed the attention of Louis and his companions in arms. The king, prostrated on the tomb of the Holy Apostle of France, implored his protection and that of his pious ancestors, whose ashes reposed in the same place. The Pope, who had come to St. Denis, placed anew the kingdom of France under the safeguard of religion, and presented to Louis VII his scrip and staff as the emblems of his pilgrimage. After the ceremony Louis set out, accompanied by Queen Eleanor and a great part of his court. He wept while he embraced Albuquerque, who could not himself restrain his tears. The people, says a modern historian, who crowded his passage, after having followed him for a long distance with the rest, vociferous applauses, returned in melancholy silence to their homes, as soon as he was out of sight. He left Metz at the head of 100,000 crusaders, traversed Germany, and directed his march towards Constantinople, where he had appointed to meet the Emperor of the West. The Emperor Conrad, after having caused his son Henry to be crowned, left Ratisbon at the beginning of spring. He was followed by an army so numerous that, according to the report of Otho of Frisian, the waves were not sufficient to transport it, nor the fields spacious enough to contain all its battalions. He had sent ambassadors to announce his coming to Constantinople, and to demand permission to cross the territories of the great empire. Manuel Comnenus returned him a most friendly and flattering answer. But when the Germans arrived in Bulgaria and Thrace, they were not long in perceiving that they must not reckon upon the promises that had been made them. At the time of the First Crusade, Constantinople was in great dread of the Turks, which was of service to the Franks. But from that period, the capital of the Greeks had experienced no alarms, and no longer feared the attacks of the Mussulmans. An opinion likewise had spread through all the provinces of the empire, that the warriors of the West entertained the project of taking possession of Constantinople. This report, probable in itself, and strengthened by the threats of the Crusaders, was very little calculated to re-establish peace and harmony between people who despised each other reciprocally, and, perhaps with equal reason, exchanged accusations of violations of the faith of treaties. Manuel Comnenus, whom Odo will not even name, because he says his name is not written in the Book of Life, was the grandson of Alexiusite, who reigned at the time of the First Crusade. Faithful to the policy of his ancestor, more able, and above all more artful, and hypocritical than he neglected no means to annoy and ruin the army of the Germans. In his councils the warriors of the West were considered as men of iron, whose eyes darted flames, and who shed torrents of blood with the same indifference as they would pour out the same quantity of water. At the same time that he sent them ambassadors, and furnished them with provisions, Manuel formed an alliance with the Turks, and fortified his capital. The Germans, in the course of their march, had often to repulse the perfidious attacks of the Greeks, and the latter had, more than once, cause to complain of the violence of the Crusaders. A relation of Conrad, who had remained sick in a monastery at Adrianople, was slain by the soldiers of Manuel. Frederick, Swabia, gave the monastery in which this crime had been committed up to the flames, and torrents of blood flowed to avenge an assassination. Upon approaching Constantinople, the Germans had set up their tents in a rich valley watered by the river Melas. All at once a violent storm burst over the neighboring mountains. The river, increased by the torrents, inundated the plain where the Christian army was celebrating the Feast of the Assumption, 275, and as if it had conspired with the Greeks, says a French historian, and as if it imitated their perfidy and treason, it carried away the horses and baggage, and brought desolation into the camp of the Crusaders. The Greeks afforded some succor to the German soldiers, but they saw with joy, in an event they affected to deplore, a presage of the defeats which threatened the armies of the Latins. Constantinople, on the
That's real. Can you imagine that? Celebrating, oh, the Blessed Virgin Assumption. God in heaven strikes you. Back momentarily. Throw down.
November steun nummer 2105. 2000 feet, track south.
On the arrival of Conrad, presented the novel spectacle of two emperors who had inherited the ranks of the Empire of Augustus, and each of whom called himself the successor of Caesar and Constantine. Their pretensions created some divisions. The Emperor of the West had a valiant army to support his rights. He of the East did not dare to insist too openly upon his. He called in perfidy to his aid, and wounded vanity avenged itself in a manner as cowardly as it was cruel. As soon as the Germans had passed the Bosphorus, they found themselves exposed to all sorts of treachery. All who straggled from the army were slain by the soldiers of Comnenus. The gates of all the cities on the route were closed. When they asked for provisions, they were obliged to put the money into the baskets which were lowered down from the walls, and after all, they frequently obtained nothing but insult and ridicule. The Greeks mixed lime with the flour they sold them. And, when the Crusaders had anything for sale, they were paid in a false coin, which was refused when they became purchasers. Ambuscades awaited them throughout the route. The enemy was aware of their line of march, and as the height of perfidy, furnished them at Constantinople with faithless guides, who misled the army in the defiles of Mount Taurus, and delivered them up, worn out with fatigue, to famine and despair, or to the swords of the Mussulmans. The Germans, ill-treated by the Greeks, did not seek to revenge themselves, although it would have been easy to have done so, and, according to the ideas of the age, would have appeared glorious. This is the reason why Montesquieu says that the Germans were the best sort of people in the world. The French, who came after them, showed themselves less patient and were more respected. The Emperor sent the principal lords of his court to the King of France, before whom they prostrated themselves, and only spoke to him on their knees. French hotness was more surprised than pleased at such homage, and only answered the flattery of the East by disdainful silence. The two monarchs had an interview, in which they reciprocated the most tender caresses, and sought to surpass each other in magnificence. If Manuel on this occasion excelled his rival in the display of his riches, he showed less sincerity than Louis in the demonstrations of his friendship, for in the midst of the banquets, which he gave to the Crusaders, the latter learned that he preserved a close alliance with the Sultan of Iconium, and that the Turks were fully informed of the plans of the French king. This treachery irritated the French lords, and when the Emperor required them to render him homage, as the leaders of the First Crusade had done, it was proposed in the council that the only reply should be to take possession of Constantinople. You have heard, said the Bishop of Lingers, that the Greeks proposed to you to recognize their empire and submit to their laws. Thus then weakness is to command strength, and cowardice bravery. What has this nation done? What have their ancestors done, that they should show so much pride? I will not speak to you of the snares and the ambushes that they have everywhere planted in your way. We have seen the priests of Byzantium mingling ridicule with outrage, purify with fire the altars at which our priests have sacrificed. They ask of us new oaths, which honor repudiates. Is it not time to revenge treasons, and repulse insults? Hitherto, the Crusaders have suffered more from their perfidy strains than from their open enemies. Constantinople has long been a troublesome barrier between us and our brothers of the East. It is our duty at last to open a free road to Asia. The Greeks, you know, have allowed the sepulchre of Christ and all the Christian cities of the East to fall into the hands of the infidels. Constantinople, there is no doubt, will soon become a prey to Turks and barbarians, and by her cowardly weakness, she will one day open the barriers of the West. The emperors of Byzantium neither know how to defend their own provinces, nor will they suffer others to do it for them. They have always impeded the generous efforts of the soldiers of the cross. Even lately, this emperor who declares himself their support, has endeavored to dispute their conquests with the Latins and ravish from them the principality of Antioch. His aim now is to deliver up the Christian armies to the Saracens. Let us hasten then to prevent our own ruin by effecting that of these traitors. Let us not leave behind us a jealous and insolent city, which only seeks the means of destroying us. Let us cast upon her the evil she prepares for us. If the Greeks accomplish their perfidious designs, it is of you the West will one day outpack its armies. Since the war we undertake is holy, is it not just that we should employ every means to succeed? Necessity, country, religion, all order you to do that which I propose to you. The aqueducts which supply the city with water are in our power, and offer an easy means of reducing the inhabitants. The soldiers of Manuel cannot stand against our battalions. A part of the walls and towers of Byzantium has crumbled away before our eyes, as by a species of miracle. It appears that God himself calls us into the city of Constantine, and he opens its gates to you as he opened the gates of Edessa, Antioch, and Jerusalem to your fathers. 276. When the Bishop of Langres had ceased to speak, several knights and barons raised their voices in reply. The Christians, they said, were come into Asia to expiate their own sins, and not to punish the crimes of the Greeks. They had taken up arms to defend Jerusalem, and not to destroy Constantinople. It was true they must consider the Greeks as heretics, but it was not more just for them to massacre than to massacre the Jews. When the Christian warriors assumed the cross, God did not put into their hands the sword of justice. In a word, the barons found much more policy than religion in that which they had heard, and could not conceive that it was right to undertake an enterprise was not in accordance with the principles of honor. Neither had they faith in the misfortunes with which they were threatened, and relied upon Providence and their own allure to enable them to surmount all obstacles. The most fervent of the pilgrims dreaded any delay in the march of the Crusaders, and this fear increased their scruples. At length the loyalty of the knights, the general pious impatience to behold the sacred places, and perhaps also the presence and the seductions of Manuel, procured a triumph for the party advocating moderation. The emperor was nevertheless alarmed at seeing a body of warriors, full of confidence and courage, thus deliberate so near to him on the conquest of his capital. The homage that the barons and knights paid him did not at all reassure him as to their intentions. To hasten their departure, he caused a report to be spread that the Germans had gained great victories over the Turks, and that they had made themselves masters of Iconium. This succeeded even beyond Manuel's hopes. When the Crusaders, impatient to pursue the Turks, were leaving Constantinople, they were surprised by an eclipse of the sun. A superstitious multitude saw in this phenomenon nothing but a fatal presage, and believed it to be either the warning of some great calamity, or of some new treachery on the part of Manuel. And the fears of the pilgrims were not long in being realized. Scarcely had they entered Bithynia when they were taught how to appreciate the false reports and perfidy of the Greeks. Louis, when encamped upon the shores of the Lake Ascanius, in the neighborhood of Nice, received information of the complete defeat of the Germans. The Sultan of Iconium, on the approach of the Christians at the west, had assembled all his forces, and at the same time solicited the aid of the other Muslim powers to defend the passages of Asia Minor. Conrad, whom William Attire styles Vir Simplex, whom Le Premier Lord compares to a victim crowned with flowers that is being led to slaughter, had advanced, on the faith of some unknown guides, into the mountains of Cappadocia. Impatient to be before the French, for whom he was to have waited, he marched on in perfect ignorance of the roads, and without provisions to feed the multitude which followed him. At a time that he entertained no suspicion of their vicinity, he was surprised by the Turks, who covered the summits of the mountains, and rushed down upon the exhausted and famished Christians. 277. The Mussulmans were lightly armed, and performed their evolutions with the greatest rapidity. The Germans could scarcely move under the weight of their bucklers, corselets, and steel bracelets. everyday skirmishes were fought, in which the Christians had the disadvantage. Such as were more lightly armed, and bore sheepskin bucklers, sometimes would rush upon the enemy and put them to flight. But the Turks soon rallied upon the heights, and darted down again, like birds of prey, upon the terrified Christians. A crowd of pilgrims, whose arms only consisted of their scrip and staff, created the greatest trouble and confusion in the Christian army. The Mussulmans took advantage of their disorder, and never allowed their enemies a moment's repose. Despair and terror put an end to all discipline among the Crusaders. They no longer obeyed the orders of their leaders, but everyone thought to ensure his own safety by flight. At length the rout became general. The country was covered with fugitives, who wandered about at hazard, and found no asylum against the conquerors. Some perished with want, others fell beneath the swords of the Mussulmans. The women and children were carried off with the baggage, and formed a part of the enemy's booty. Conrad, who had scarcely saved the 10th part of his army, was himself wounded by 2 arrows, and only escaped the pursuit of the Saracens by a kind of miracle. The news of this disaster threw the French into the greatest consternation. Louis, accompanied by his bravest warriors, flew to the assistance of Conrad. The 2 monarchs embraced in tears. Conrad related the particulars of his defeat, and complained the more bitterly of the perfidy of Manuel, from feeling the necessity of excusing his own imprudence. The 2 princes renewed their oath to repair together to Palestine, but the Emperor of Germany did not keep his word. Whether he was ashamed of being without an army, whether he could not endure the haughtiness of the French, or that he dreaded their too just reproaches, he sent back the few troops he had left, and returned to Constantinople, where he was very well received, because he was no longer to be feared. The French army, in the meantime, pursued its march, and, leaving Mount Olympus on its left, and Mount Ida on its right, passed through ancient Phrygia. The French, on their passage, passed Pergamus, Ephesus, and several other celebrated cities, which the Greeks had allowed to go to ruin. Winter was coming on, and the abundant rains and melted snows had swollen the rivers till they overflowed the country, and made the roads impracticable. The inhabitants of the mountains, a savage, wild people, fled away at the approach of the Christians, taking with them their flocks, and all that they possessed. The inhabitants of the cities shut their gates against the Crusaders, and refused provisions to all who had no full value to give in return. Whilst the French army was crossing Phrygia, Manuel sent ambassadors to the King of France, to inform him that the Turks were assembling in all ports for the purpose of impeding his march. He offered the Crusaders an asylum in the cities of the Empire. But this offer, accompanied by menaces, appeared to be only a snare, and Louis preferred braving the enmity of the Turks to trusting to the promises of the Greeks. The Christian army pursuing its march towards the frontiers of Phrygia, arrived at last at the banks of the Meander, towards the embouchure of the Lycus. The Turks, who had destroyed the army of the Germans, prepared to dispute the passage of the river with the French. Some were encamped on the mountains, others on the banks. The rains had swollen the Meander, and the passage was difficult and dangerous. Animated by the speeches and the example of their king, no obstacle could stop the French. In vain the Turks showered their arrows upon them, or formed their battle array on the banks. The French army crossed the river, broke through the ranks of the barbarians, slaughtered vast numbers of them, and pursued them to the foot of the mountains. The 2 shores of the Meander were covered with the bodies of the Turks. The historian Nicetas, 278, who some years after saw their heaped up bones, could not help saying, whilst praising the courage of the Franks, that if such men did not take Constantinople, their moderation and patience were much to be admired. After the battle they had fought with the Saracens, some pilgrims asserted that they had seen a knight, clothed in white, march at the head of the army, and give the signal for victory. Otto of Toul, an ocular witness, speaks of this apparition, without giving faith to it, and satisfies himself with saying that the Christians would not have triumphed over the Turks without the protection and the will of God. This victory gave great confidence to the Crusaders, and rendered their enemies more cautious. The Turks, whom it was impossible to pursue far in an unknown country, rallied again after the Battle of the Meander. Less confident in their strength, and not daring to attack an army that had conquered them, they watched for a moment in which they might fatally surprise them. The imprudence of Omer, who commanded the French vanguard, soon presented to them this opportunity. On the plain of the Abbasia, a city situated on the left, the Crusaders had directed their course towards the mountains which separate Phrygia from Pisidia. These mountains offered nothing but narrow passages, in which they constantly marched between rocks and precipices. The French army was divided into two bodies, commanded every day by new leaders, who received their orders from the king. Every evening they moved down in council the route they were to follow the next day, and ordered the place where the army was to encamp. One day when they had to cross one of the highest mountains, the order had been given to the vanguard to encamp on the heights, and to wait for the rest of the army, so that they might descend into the plain that next day in order of battle. Geoffrey de Rankin, Lord of Tembourg, this day commanded the first body of the French army, and bore the oriflamme, or royal standard. He arrived early and saw where he was to pass the night, which offered no retreat for his soldiers but woods, ravines, and barren rocks. At the foot of the mountain they beheld an extensive and commodious valley. The day was fine, and the troops were in a condition to march without fatigue several hours longer. The Count de Maurienne, brother of the king, came out north, and all the ladies of her suite, who had accompanied the vanguard, pressed Geoffrey de Rankin to descend into the plain. He had the weakness to comply with their wishes. But scarcely had he gained the valley, when the Turks took possession of the heights he had passed, and ranged themselves in order of battle. During this time the rear guard of the army, in which was the king, advanced full of confidence and security. On seeing troops in the woods, and on the rocks, they supposed them to be the French, and saluted them with cries of joy. They marched without order, the beasts of burden, and the chariots were mingled with the battalions, and the greater part of the soldiers had left their arms with the baggage. The Turks, perfectly motionless, waited in silence till the Christian army should be enclosed in the defiles, and when they thought themselves sure of victory, they moved forward, uttering frightful cries, and, sword in hand, fell upon the unarmed Christians, who had no time to rally. The disorder and confusion of the French army cannot be described. Above us, says an ocular witness, steep rocks rose up to the clouds. Beneath us precipices, dug by the torrent, descended to the infernal regions. The Crusaders were upon a narrow path, upon which men and horses could neither advance nor retreat. They dragged each other down into the abysses. Whilst rocks, detached from the tops of the mountains, rolling down with horrible noise, crushed everything in their passage. The cries of the wounded and the dying mingled with the confused roar of the torrents, the hissing of the arrows, and the neighing of the terrified horses. In this frightful tumult the leaders gave no orders, and the soldiers could neither fight nor fly. The bravest rallied around the king, and advanced towards the top of the mountain. 30 of the principal nobles that accompanied Louis perished on his side, selling their lives dearly. The king remained almost alone on the field of battle, and took refuge upon the rock, whence he bravely attacked the infidels who pursued him. With his back against a tree, he singly resisted the efforts of several Saracens, who, taking him for a simple soldier, at length left him to secure their share of the pillage. Although the night began to fall, the king expected to be attacked again, when the voices of some Frenchmen who had escaped the carnage gave him the agreeable information that the Turks had retired. He mounted a stray horse, and, after 1,000 perils, rejoined his vanguard, where all were lamenting his death. After this defeat, in which the king had been exposed to such dangers, the report of his death was not only spread throughout the East, but reached Europe, where it filled the Christians, particularly the French, with grief and terror. William of Tyre, whilst relating the disastrous defeat of the Crusaders, expresses astonishment that God, always full of mercy, should have allowed so many illustrious warriors, armed in his cause, to perish so miserably. The Crusaders who formed the vanguard of the army, whilst deploring the death of their brethren, raised their voices against Geoffrey de Rankin, and demanded that the loss of so much blood should be visited upon him. The king, however, had not sufficient firmness to punish an irreparable fault, and only so far yielded to the wishes of the barons and the soldiers as to give them as a leader an old warrior named Gilbert, whose skill and bravery were the boast of the whole army. Gilbert shared the command with Everard Desbars, Grand Master of the Templars, who had come, with a great number of his knights, to meet the Christian army. Under these two leaders, whom the king himself obeyed, the Crusaders continued their march, and avenged their defeat several times upon the Mussulmans. On their arrival in Pisidia, the French had almost everywhere to defend themselves against the perfidy of the Greeks and the attacks of the Turks. But winter was even a more dangerous enemy than these to the Christian army. Torrents of rain fell every day. Cold and humidity enervated the powers of the soldiers, and the greater part of the horses, being destitute of forage, perished, and only served to feed the army, which was without provisions. The clothes of the soldiers hung about them in rags. The Crusaders sold or abandoned their arms. The tents and baggage lay scattered on the roads, and the army dragged in its train a crowd of sick, and numbers of poor pilgrims, who made the air resound with their cries and lamentations. The King of France consoled them by his discourses, and relieved them by his charitable gifts. For in the midst of so many reverses, God alone seemed to sustain his courage. Never, says Odo of Toul, did he pass a single day without hearing Mass, and without invoking the God of the Christians. At last the Christians arrived before the walls of Italia, situated on the coast of Pamphylia, at the mouth of the river Cestius. This city, inhabited by Greeks, was governed in the name of the Emperor of Constantinople. As the inhabitants were mistrustful of the intentions of the Christian army, they refused to open their gates to them, and the Crusaders were obliged to encamp on the neighboring plains, exposed to all the rigors of the season. They could neither find provisions for themselves nor forage for their horses in a barren, uncultivated country, constantly ravaged by the Turks. The Greeks refused to assist them in their distress, and sold them everything at its weight in gold. And the evils which the Christians had hitherto suffered became still more insupportable to them when they lost all hope. Louis VII, having called a council, the chief men of the army represented to him that the Crusaders were without horses and without arms. They were not in a condition to give an enemy battle, nor could they support the fatigues of a long march. There remained, they added, no other resource for the Christians but to abandon themselves to the perils of the sea. 279. The king did not agree with their opinion, and wished that they should only embark the multitude of pilgrims that embarrassed the march of the army. As for us, said he, we will redouble our courage, and we will follow the road which our fathers, who conquered Antioch and Jerusalem, followed. Whilst anything remains to me, I will share it with my companions. And, when I shall have nothing left, which of you will not undergo with me, poverty and misery? The barons, touched with his speech, swore to die with their king, but were not willing to die without glory. Animated by the example of Louis, they might triumph over the Turks, over their misfortunes, and the rigors of winter. But they were without defense against famine and the perfidy of the Greeks. They reproached Louis VII with not having followed the counsels of the Bishop of Lyons, and with having fought in enemies more cruel than the Mussulmans, more dangerous than the tempests or rocks of the ocean. As at the end of this council, strong murmurs against the Greeks arose in the Christian army, the governor of Italia became fearful of the effects of despair, and came to offer Louis vessels in which to embark all the Crusaders. This proposition was accepted, but they had to wait for the promised missiles more than 5 weeks. In so long a delay, the Crusaders consumed all the resources they had left, and many died of hunger and misery. The vessels which at length arrived in the ports of Italia were neither large enough nor sufficient in number to embark the whole Christian army. The Crusaders then perceived the abyss of evils into which they were about to fall. But such was their resignation, or rather the deplorable state of the army, that they committed no violence towards the Greeks, and did not even threaten a single city which refused to help them. A crowd of poor pilgrims, among whom were barons and knights, appeared before the king, and spoke to him in these terms: "We have not means wherewith to pay for our passage, and we cannot follow you into Syria. We remain here victims to misery and disease. When you shall have left us, we shall be exposed to greater perils. And being attacked by the Turks is the least of the misfortunes we have to dread. Remember that we are Franks, that we are Christians. Give us leaders who may console us for your absence, and assist us to endure the fatigue, the hunger, and the death which await us." Louis, in order to reassure them, spoke to them in the most feeling terms, and distributed considerable sums amongst them. He was as liberal in his assistance, says Otto Tadeau, as if he had lost nothing, or wanted nothing for himself.
Well, I don't know. I wanted to make it a little bit better. So